תודה רבה, רונית. Thank you, רונית. Our next speaker, Kineret.
Yeah.
Switch places.
Those of you who took part in the previous session heard from Dan Alexander of the Association of Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI, about the meetings of the Tradition and Human Rights Group. For those of you who haven't participated in the previous session, I will soon elaborate on these meetings. For now, I will just say that the participants belong to two main social groups, human rights activists and Mizrahi Ultra-Orthodox educators, mostly identified with Shas party. In what follows, the meeting will provide a trigger for discussing two questions informed by a post-liberal perspective. First, how to explain the willingness of Mizrahi Orthodox educators to meet human rights activists, and how to translate the understanding of at least some of the possible motivations into a sociological research. Second, how can observation of these meetings through the anthropological lens of translating human rights discourse into local settings teach us about the potential they hold for human rights activists in Israel on the one hand, and the liberal grammar that underlies the anthropological discourse on the other. So let's go. During the past 2 years, I was privileged to take part in the meetings of the Tradition and Human Rights group. My role was to document the meetings, and after each one, I wrote a report and sent it to the organizing committee. A major factor leading to the initiation of these meetings was the publication of Mizrahi's paper, Nissim, who also joined, you've heard in the previous session, Beyond the Garden and the Jungle, the Social Boundaries of Human Rights Discourse in Israel in Maaseh Mishpat Journal. In this paper, Mizrahi pointed to the failure of Israeli human rights discourse to expand its circles of support and reach broader sectors of Israeli society, and in particular the target population of traditional Mizrahim. As a key to resolving this issue, Mizrahi offered human rights activists to turn their critical gaze inward to the discourse itself, and from this position create a dialogue with opponents' groups. After reading the article, key figures in ACRI decided to initiate meetings with representatives of the traditional Mizrahi public. It was clear that an elite group was needed, one that could serve as an equal partner to the human rights activists, all of them highly educated and with impressive cultural capital. It was also necessary for group members to reliably represent the view of the broad Mizrahi traditional public. To this end, the mediating organization named Shacharit, chosen by ACRI to facilitate the meetings, contacted two groups. One was a group of traditionalist Mizrahi intellectuals and activists who are in some senses close to liberalism but do not belong to the Mizrahi critical discourse. The second was made up of ultra-Orthodox Sephardic educators. While the meeting got off to a difficult start, with the traditionalist group being more dominant in the first couple of meetings, from the third meeting onwards, key representatives joined the ultra-Orthodox group, and the meeting got on the right track. Now that I've given you some background on how the meeting got started, I would like to tell you about my initially skeptic position regarding the chances of success. Being closely involved with Mizrahi's work and highly aware of what goes behind the scenes in ACRI, it was completely clear to me why human rights activists should have an interest in those meetings. But I was pretty doubtful about the other parties' motivation for participating. I remember myself asking Nissim again and again, but why should they? What's in it for them? After the ultra-Orthodox group members became dominant in the process, I became acquainted with their positive attitude and passion for dialogue. And I realized how wrong I was. From that moment on, my question received a twist. I started with, okay, I'm convinced that they want to come, but then added, but why? This question kept bothering me throughout the past 2 years. After each meeting, I would leave impressed with the ultra-Orthodox participants' wisdom and the challenge they posed to the human rights activists, but the motivation remained a mystery to me. Today, I think I have some answers to this question. Before elaborating on them, I would like to stress at least that, at least for now, they are not based on a thoroughly conducted empirical investigation, but rather on my initial impressions, which I intend to test later on in my research. Given that, the first answer focuses on the desire to create a Jewish civil space where ultra-Orthodox are accepted and respected by the secular majority group, which often not only holds their very religiosity in contempt, but is also highly critical of the way of life and the political and ethical conduct of their elected representatives. The second answer is quite different and, in my opinion, more surprising. It has to do with what Adam Seligman defines as the challenge of living together differently. According to Seligman, who relies on the writings of the late sociologist Shmuel Noach Eisenstadt, two of the three challenges faced by every society are: one, expanding trust beyond the primordial family unit, and two, giving meaning to individual lives and collective endeavors. Seligman also argues that the religion and religious education are traditionally perceived as the most obvious source of meaning, an idea reinforced by the collapse of the great secular ideologies of the turn of the 20th century. In traditional societies, argues Seligman, but also increasingly in secular European societies, problems of meaning, of understanding human beings placed in the world, of good and evil, and the definition of a good life are addressed mainly in the religious framework. However, if that is the way things are, Seligman explains, we are faced with a challenge, because usually it is impossible to provide a frame of meaning, let alone a religious one, without using the language of community, of belonging, of who is one of us and who isn't, of who can be trusted and who can't, a language that determines the boundaries of membership in our community. The predicament naturally worsens when ethno-national identities become entwined with religious ones. When that happens, we are faced with a huge challenge if we want to establish an inclusive civil society for those who do not belong to the same religious community. As mentioned, Seligman described this challenge as the problem of living together differently. This challenge is particularly great in societies which are profoundly diverse and in which religion attached to ethno-national identity is used as a key or even primary source of meaning. According to this definition, the challenge of living together differently is a major one for Israeli society in its entirety, given the very definition of the State of Israel as Jewish and democratic. That is, a state which binds together religiousness, ethnicity, and nationality as the foundation of its political existence. But I think that unlike secular groups in Israeli society, whether more or less liberal, this challenge is not only more burning for contemporary ultra-Orthodox society, but also more complex. Why burning? The last meeting of Tradition and Human Rights Group before last year's summer vacation was held soon after the killing of the 3 Jewish teenagers by Palestinian terrorists in the West Bank. This led to a severe deterioration in Jewish-Arab relations, which took another turn for the worst following the war in Gaza. This socio-political storm involved at least 2 dramatic events and maybe daily events in which the Mizrahi Orthodox sector took center stage. One is the revenge killing of a Palestinian teenager from East Jerusalem. The leader of the Jewish group allegedly behind the act is a religious Mizrahi man whose father is a well-respected head of a yeshiva in Jerusalem's Har Nof Orthodox neighborhood. The other is the arson of the Jewish Arab bilingual school in Jerusalem. The perpetrators sprayed on the school's walls the message Kahana was right, no coexistence with cancer, and assimilation with Gentiles is a sin. This took place in direct response to the murder of Jews praying in a synagogue at Har Nof neighborhood. In this case as well, the suspects are religious Mizrahi youngsters living in Jerusalem and in the ultra-Orthodox settlement of Beitar Illit. In addition, Palestinian bus drivers reported severe physical and verbal assault by Jewish youngsters on a daily basis, mainly in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem and in nearby settlements, which led many of them to quit their jobs. I think that these examples clearly indicate why the challenge of creating political space of mutual respect is a particularly burning one for the ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi community. But just as it is burning, this challenge is also complex. We have to realize that this community may appreciate and respect the democratic system in many senses and would not seek to replace it with any other, but that it also finds the liberal human rights discourse mostly aligned. It is not only a threatening discourse, as argued by Mizrahi, but also one that is relatively devoid of emotion, and as such detached from the community's frame of meaning, everything that enables it to create solidarity, trust, fraternity, and compassion, everything that motivates it. Relatedly, it is also laden with foreign values, Western and secular, of rationality, choice, autonomy, and rights. Therefore, in order for it to work, every solution to the challenge of living together differently must relate to the ultra-Orthodox community's world of meaning. This means it would have to be essentially non-liberal and rely on Judaism for justification. Are such solutions conceivable? Are they available? If they are, how can they work? I believe that the answer to the first two questions is yes. There is an emergent discourse which attempts to find Jewish non-liberal solutions for the problem of the other. I believe this is one of the key reasons for the willingness of those Mizrahi educators to meet with human rights activists who claim to be experts on resolving the problem of difference. But how do such solutions work? What are the boundaries? What are their strengths and weaknesses? Those are questions I hope to be able to answer at the end of my research project. So hitherto, I have relied on tradition and human rights meetings as well as last summer event to discuss the democratic challenge facing Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox educators. In that, I've largely relied on Seligman's assumption that religious education is not only the cause of the problem, but also the key to its solution. But are the ultra-Orthodox educators the only ones holding the key? And if they are, and even if not, what is the role of human rights activists in these situations I've described? When discussing those questions, we must bear in mind the socio-political background in Israel which have been referred to in the previous session, where human rights activists belong to an Ashkenazi secular, liberal, educated, and left-wing elite that alienates broad sectors of Israeli society. This social position enables them, mainly in situation of the kind previously described, little more than to cry out loud against what they consider sheer racism. This reaction, however, awakens mainly anger and antagonism among the Mizrahi public, both traditional and ultra-Orthodox, and very little desire to change, if at all. What then can human rights activists do to generate change? I believe that the anthropological literature, combined with the experience of the tradition and human rights meetings, can give us a pretty big clue. Over the past 20 years, anthropologists have changed their approach to study of human rights. Anthropology, which have until then avoided scholarly and political discussion of human rights, began producing a relatively new body of knowledge named Anthropology of Human Rights. A group of studies included in this body of knowledge seeks to understand the cultural processes that shape global human rights ideas in local socio-cultural environments in a way that enables the organization trying to promote them to gain the local population legitimacy, agreement, and cooperation. As suggested by Tzvika Or, these processes have been variously conceptualized in the literature as localization, vernacularization, domestication, indigenization, localization, and creolization. NGOs are described as central to these processes, mainly as translators. This group of studies hints at the way human rights activists can generate change in local environments, while a post-liberal perspective on this literature can teach us quite a bit about the conceptual boundaries characteristic of many of the anthropological writings on this matter. One of the prominent anthropologists in this field is Sally Engel Mary. Mary's work revolved around vernacularization, the process of adopting and appropriating global human rights concepts in a way that makes them more acceptable locally. In this process, she argues, human rights ideas are rephrased to suit the local socio-political context where they seek acceptance. In her work with Peggy Levitt, Mary argues that vernacularization processes are collective efforts made by multiple players that can be imagined as chains of actors that stretch from the global sites where global human rights documents and concepts are produced, such as New York, Geneva, or Vienna, to various localities around the world, where ordinary people adopt them. Those chains are made up of various players in different social positions. Mary and Levi described 3 such positions. The first is that of the anointed. These are local leaders the international community chooses to invent in because they are considered critical for the task. Their education, status, and cultural capital allow them to attract a significant part of the international resources that flow into their country, and they are considered to be agents on the ground who know about human rights and are essential for this dissemination. They are displayed as such in conferences and workshops abroad, while on the other hand, they may be trusted to represent the sponsors before guests and government officials. The second group is cosmopolitan elites. This group is also active on the global level. These are individuals who have often lived and studied abroad or in large urban centers and belong to networks of activists and academics where they study and teach about global values packages. As such, they interact with foreigners and foreign ideas on a regular basis. The third, and perhaps the largest group, includes the beneficiaries of vernacularization, who are also its key actors. These are relatively local actors who do not travel abroad often and are exposed to new ideas about and practices in interactions with the anointed and the cosmopolitan elites. They are responsible for secondary translation to the vernacular, designed for the clients or volunteers of civil society organizations. Thus, according to Mary and Levi, there is no single translator mediating between the global and the local, but a series of mediators who all take part in this translation or vernacularization effort. Let us now return to the Israeli context and the event of the last summer. How do these anthropological insights suggest a more effective activist approach than crying out against racism? While the social position of most human rights organizations in Israel is one particularly dissociated from the lives of many sectors in society, Mary and Levi's model and my own experience in the traditional human rights meetings enable us to consider additional links required to mediate between those organizations and the ordinary people on the ground. These links can be made up of local agents bridging between the organization and their target populations. These agents will be able to help the organization consider new ways of generating effective change among their concrete audiences and subsequently also lead the change. This is because as local agents, they are seen within their communities as organic and authentic messengers, a position enabling them to deliver a message that challenges the community's customs or consensus. Thus, this is a two-way street in which the organizations rely on local personnel, but also offer them new paths for thinking and acting that they often need as an air to breathe. Adopting this model, however, raises a difficult question regarding the nature of the message delivered by these agents and the boundaries of the translation proposed. Will the message remain liberal, secular, a human rights message par excellence? If not, what is the extent of the compromise organization can and should abide with? Mary's answer is pretty clear. I'm quoting, "But translation does not mean transformation. Despite changes in the cultural phrasing of human rights ideas and the structural condition of interventions, the underlying assumption of person and action remains the same. Human rights are part of a distinctive modernist vision of the good and just society that emphasizes autonomy, choice, equality, secularism, and protection of the body. As human rights are vernacularized, this conception of the person, the state and the community are not changed. My experience as participant and documenter of the traditional human rights meetings is that any translation that remains within the boundaries of the liberal grammar as suggested by Mary will not produce effective change. My own impression is that only a human rights approach that seeks to lead to change out of a true respect for the other group's underlying assumptions as presented by Akri in the meetings can create an opening for honest dialogue and sustainable commitment to long-term cooperation. This means that perhaps the change sought by human rights organizations can materialize, at least in some areas, only within the boundaries of the normative level, without permitting the underlying assumptions of many groups in Israeli society. If so, it would seem that human rights organizations are faced with a conundrum, above all in relation to their objective. Should they be relatively modest but possibly more effective, achieving normative change for target groups victimized by human rights violation, or rather more far-reaching in their vision but with fewer chances of success in leading a deep change across the broad of Israeli society? While the organizations may deliberate these questions and decide on the position that seems right to them, I believe that the position of anthropologists or sociologists studying the phenomena must be quite removed from the committed and uncompromising stance proposed by Mary. In fact, following Amitav Acharia, I believe researchers should take a more agnostic position towards the type of translation carried out in practice and commit, at most, to act for a just, prosperous, and better society, be its underlying assumptions liberal or otherwise. This is the post-liberal path which I believe contemporary anthropology should follow. Thank you.